Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Fighters for Freedom Juneteenth conversation. This evening, we gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here in the Washington, D.C. region, the Native peoples on whose ancestral homeland we are gathered. We encourage you to explore Native Land Digital Map to learn more about the Indigenous communities, to be honored and recognized wherever you are joining us from today. And there will be a link in the chat. My name is Dalila Scruggs. I am the Augusta Savage Curator of African American Art here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And it's an absolute honor to serve as the moderator for tonight's event. I want to first start by thanking everyone who made this program possible. My thanks first goes to SAAM's director, Stephanie Stebish. I'm also grateful to Gloria Kenyon, Chantel Jones-Williams, Carlos Parada, Alicia Tarmarchenko, Valerie Cooper, and Jane Carpenter-Rock. And of course, thank you to my fellow panelists, Phoebe Hillemann and Kenlontae Turner. Before we get started, there are just a few administrative details to attend to. First, closed captions are available. You can enable them by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. This program is being recorded and will be available on SAAM's YouTube channel. SAAM's program staff will also be sharing information with you via the chat. In turn, you can communicate with us using the Q&A function. There will be time at the end where we will answer your questions. We ask that you adhere to SAAM's terms of use, and we reserve the right to remove any off-topic questions, as well as the right to ask you to leave if your behavior is deemed inappropriate. At the end of the program, please take a moment to complete our post-program survey to provide us with feedback on your experience. So you'll have to leave your browser window open so that the survey is available. Thank you so much for joining us. So to begin, we are here today to celebrate Juneteenth by exploring SAAM's current exhibition, Fighters for Freedom. As many of you know, this holiday commemorates June 19th, 1865, when Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas, with an executive decree that emancipated more than 250,000 enslaved people. Although the holiday originated in Texas, the tradition has spread across the South and it is today celebrated as a national holiday. We are in its eve, Juneteenth Eve. Juneteenth is an opportunity for us to bear witness to a long history of African-American freedom struggles and recommit ourselves to the principles of democracy, citizenship, and self-determination. May I have the next slide? So in line with Juneteenth's message of freedom and justice, SAAM's current exhibition, Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson, Picturing Justice, examines these very themes. The exhibition was beautifully organized by Virginia Mecklenburg and Laura Augustine Fox. And I'll pause to say that Virginia has just retired after 40 years of service to SAAM. During her long tenure, she was the careful steward of SAAM's African-American holdings and has worked tirelessly to interpret and display the work of William H. Johnson. I'm exceptionally grateful to be coming in on the heels of this wonderful exhibition. May I have the next slide? Today, I am joined in conversation by Kenlontae Turner and Phoebe Hillemann. And so I'm gonna invite them to come on screen now to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kenlontae Turner, and I'm the Curator of Collections at the Hampton University Museum. And we are very, very fortunate to have two paintings from our permanent collection included in the Fighters for Freedom exhibition. And so I'm very excited to be here with you all today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Phoebe Hillemann. I'm the Teacher Institute's educator here at SAAM. And I had the privilege to act as the interpretive lead on the Fighters for Freedom exhibition, collaborating with the curatorial and exhibit design teams, as well as with my interpretation colleagues, Emily Berg and Anne Showalter. And interpretation's role in the planning process was really to think about how best to engage audiences with the content of the exhibition. So I'm really excited to share a little bit about that with you tonight.
Thank you both. So for the order of operations, I'll get started by providing a very brief overview of William H. Johnson's career. And then I'm going to really turn the program over to Kenlontae and Phoebe, who will talk more about their respective roles in the development of the exhibition. We hope that our audience will also play a role here. Can I have the next slide? And together, we would love to collectively think a little bit more about how Johnson's work resonates with the lessons of Juneteenth and the relevance of Johnson's work to today's world. After all three of us have spoken, we will open the floor to responses from the audience. We encourage you to think about these questions. Who is your freedom fighter? Who inspires you by fighting for freedom today? After considering this question specifically, we will invite you to offer your responses into the Q&A function of the program, and we'll share out a few, and then we'll pivot to a final round of Q&A amongst the panelists. Okay, may I have the next slide, please? To lay the groundwork for this conversation, I'll offer just a very brief overview of the artist William H. Johnson. Johnson was born in Florence, South Carolina in 1901. As a young man, he migrated to New York City, where he received a rigorous academic training at the National Academy of Design. After completing his formal education, Johnson traveled to France and continued his artistic development. May I have the next slide? Johnson was a stylistic chameleon. He absorbed myriad aesthetic influences, including the topsy-turvy expressionism of Haim Soutine, which you can kind of see on the left, and then the thick impostered brushstroke of Vincent van Gogh, which is apparent on the right. May I have the next slide? He then landed on an approach that exploited a flattened arrangement of colors and shapes thickly applied with brush and palette knife. Except for a very brief return to the United States in 1929, Johnson lived in Europe for the better part of 15 years. He married Danish artist Holka Kraka and adopted her hometown, Ketterminga, as his home base. Together, William and Holka traveled across Scandinavia and into other parts of Europe. May I have the next slide, please? From his earliest days in Denmark, Johnson positioned himself as a modern primitive, authentically connected with a vital pre-industrial ethos. And this outlook was likely informed very much by his wife Holka's interest in uplifting Danish folk culture. And I'm showing an example of that on the left there. This extended engagement with Scandinavian folk culture laid the conceptual groundwork for Johnson's return to the United States and embrace of his own Black Southern roots as a distinctive folk culture and a rich font of modernist inspiration. As Johnson wrote, "I am feeling that I would like my own homeland next, as I know of no better country to inspire me in this period of my artistic development." So Johnson returns to the United States in 1938, and within 6 months, he forged the style for which he is best known. The work from this period combines a modernist interest in high-key color, flatness, abstraction, along with a patterning that resembles African-American quilt making and the proportions of African statuary. And all of this comes together to reflect Johnson's unique take on Black vernacular culture. May I have the next slide? So Fighters for Freedom was his very last body of work. The series focuses primarily on major heroes of African-American history, including Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, and Harriet Tubman. This series was a manifestation of a larger trend in African-American art at the time, which looked back to the bravery of these historic figures as a usable past that could be employed as exemplars of Black resistance as a model for present-day struggle. So I'll leave it here and I'll turn it over to Kenlontae Turner to pick up the story and tell us more about how Hampton University had a role in preserving Johnson's legacy.
Thanks, Dalila. Hello, everyone, again. I will talk a little bit more about the connection between the Harmon Foundation and William H. Johnson and how we at Hampton University came to house some of his amazing work. And of course, a little bit more in depth about the two pieces included in the exhibition. Many things can be said about Johnson's life, as a lot of people would describe him leading a very bohemian lifestyle and following in that tradition of Black artists leaving the States for better opportunities and education. But in his later years, his life was pretty riddled with several tragedies. Arguably, the most devastating one was the passing of his wife, Holka, in 1944 due to cancer. Those who have studied his life and work will say that his wife's passing is what led to further deterioration of his mental health. Also, his mental health had been declining for some time, even before her passing, due to him having been untreated for those issues for several years. Ultimately, in 1947, Johnson was admitted in the Central Islip State Hospital on Long Island, where he would remain until his death in 1970. During the time he was institutionalized, his work was in danger of being destroyed as the funding for storing the work, funding provided by the state, was diminishing. An organization known as the Harmon Foundation was alerted to this and stepped in. The Harmon Foundation, which was founded in the early 1920s, was an extremely influential philanthropic organization that helped foster the development of many artists, especially Black artists closely affiliated with the Harlem Renaissance. Several of these artists, like Augusta Savage, Richmond Barthé, Aaron Douglas, and Hale Woodruff, received tremendous support from the foundation in the form of traveling exhibitions, job opportunities. Several of these artists had actual jobs within the organization, and creating connections with patrons, helping them to sell their work. Prior to him being hospitalized, Johnson had a deep relationship with the foundation so that when his work was at risk of being destroyed, they were called on to become the legal stewards of his work, with the promise of receiving unconditional rights to the works once they had them. Then in 1967, as the foundation was dissolving, the works were transferred to the NCFA, or the National Collection of Fine Arts, which is today known as the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The NCFA then offered the works to HBCUs like Fisk, Howard, Morgan State, Hampton, of course, North Carolina Central, South Carolina State, Tuskegee, and Clark Atlanta. It is said that while Johnson was in the institution, he had very little knowledge or understanding of what was happening with his work, although friends would send him brochures and try their best to keep him aware of the exhibitions and institutional connections that were being made with his work. It registered less and less with him as his mental health got worse. And so this, in my opinion, is why I think it is extremely important to continue to honor his legacy and his life work. Now we will take a closer look at the two works from Hampton's collection that are included in the exhibition at SAAM. Next slide. Okay, so first we will talk about the three great freedom fighters. Now, before I talk about this piece in depth, I wanted to give you all just about like 15 seconds or so to closely look at this piece, and then we will discuss. And I invite Phoebe and Dalila to close look as well. And so again, I'll give us about 15 seconds or so. All right, Phoebe, did you have any observations that you had about this particular piece?
Yeah, I think when I look at this piece, my eyes are really quickly drawn to the clasped hands of the three figures, which are almost in the very center of the painting. And I'm noticing how the rest of the composition is very vertical and horizontal, but we have the arms of the two figures on either side of Harriet Tubman, sort of making those diagonal lines, drawing our eye towards the center. So I think Johnson really wanted us to notice that part of the painting.
Absolutely. One thing that I love, William H. Johnson is one of my favorite artists, and one of the things I love about his work is, although they tend to be simplistic in style and quite accessible, in my opinion, he was always very intentional about his compositions. And so this painting was created in 1945, as you can see, and depicts three figures: John Brown, Harriet Tubman in the center, and Frederick Douglass. All of these figures who had the same goal or ambition for the future, but very different tactics in achieving that goal. And one thing to note, all three figures were acquainted with each other, which is probably a fact that many people may not know about. And as you noted in the composition, Harriet is in the center. And if you look closely, we can go to the next slide. How about close up? She is quite literally what is connecting the group, with how she is not only holding each of the male figures' hands, but they are also kind of like crossed and entwined. One can interpret this as like a figure like Harriet being not only a foundational figure in the fight for freedom, but one that connected others to create a truly transformative and abolitionist movement. And I think Johnson's depiction and treatment of Harriet is not without significance. And I think he undoubtedly acknowledged how she was a foundational figure in American history and the fight for freedom overall. Dalila, did you have any things to note?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on what you were saying about sort of the simple style. I mean, as we learned from the overview, he clearly styled himself self-consciously as like a like creating a naive style. But I think it also reflects his source material. This is somebody who got himself to the New York Public Library, was reading books, looking at 19th century materials. And so I wonder whether the stiff poses that you see here is not just about style, but also the stiff poses of 19th century photography. And so what we're seeing here is kind of many layers of history kind of brought together in this composition, where we're actually getting a sense of like the posing styles and the material culture of the time before that he's engaging with.
Absolutely. And I also think that point is particularly underscored in how he depicts her outfit, particularly her dress. Before coming to Hampton, personally, I had never seen Harriet Tubman depicted with another iconic American symbol. And in this case, it's the colors of the American flag. And if we go to the next slide, Johnson depicts her with the colors of the American flag again in this painting you see on the left. And to me, I would argue this was Johnson kind of like reckoning with the question of, who is really considered an American hero, or if we want to ground things in the current conversation that's happening in today's society, who is allowed in the mainstream canon of American history, or what kind of boxes are we putting on figures like Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass? Now you can definitely see that Johnson was definitely, looking at these more traditional images that you see on the right. One is a wood engraving on paper by John G. Darby. And he, of course, used these as references for his own paintings. And again, I think the idea of, or the question of how do we as a society reflect on the lasting legacy of these figures was definitely something at the forefront of his mind when doing this series. It is also worth noting, as you mentioned, so many of the works that SAAM received from the Harmon Foundation were these, they're very beautiful in my opinion, preliminary sketches and notes from William H. Johnson himself. Here you can get a bit of insight into his process. Johnson would often trace the reference image and place that tracing where he would like to put it in the composition. This would likely help the artist to better imagine the appropriate placement of the composite images in the larger context of the piece. And I must say, as a visual artist myself, it's definitely a technique that's very helpful. So can we go to the next slide, please? So next we have this painting titled Against the Odds. And again, I'll give the audience about 15 seconds to simply observe the work, and then we will discuss. Okay. So this painting, as you can see, there's not much to interpret, but there's still a lot to unpack here. This painting depicts 13 figures, and if you were curious as to who they are, we can go to the next slide. So the top row features Paul Robeson, Mary McLeod Bethune, and George Washington Carver. Next slide. The middle row shows Joe Louis, Marion Anderson, Langston Hughes, Walter White, and W.B. Du Bois. And next slide. Then the final row shows Richard Wright, A. Philip Randolph, Charles S. Johnson, Mordecai Johnson, and William Grant Still. Now, some of you may be wondering why these figures, although important, why these figures? Next slide, please. So Johnson had depicted these 13 figures as a result of the publishing of a book titled 13 Against the Odds. And this was a book published by Edwin Rogers in 1944. Rogers had set out to write about African Americans who had not only been pioneers in their respective fields and communities, but also for the country at large. Now, to compile this list, Rogers had actually talked to over 200 white and Black Americans and had asked them who they believed should be included on this roster. Rogers wrote, quote, "These are success stories in the best American tradition of creating new frontiers, for these people have been breaking the barriers that hedged the marginal man. There are also stories of very human beings, of good, tough personalities, with the joys and sorrows common to all men, with the extra pain that comes with the prejudices of their neighbors, and the added zest that comes with climbing from social depths to the pinnacles of distinction," end quote. The images you see on the right side are the actual images from this book. And you can see, again, going back to the sketching he did with the Harriet Tubman piece, you can see where he used these beautiful images as reference photos for his own paintings. Now, the composition of this painting is one you will see again in a piece we will talk a little bit more about with Phoebe's section, but you will clearly notice that there is not much to interpret here again. There's no background, just simple renderings of the figures. I think this was Johnson's way of really highlighting the figures and making it kind of like a springboard for audiences to engage in discussions such as who are these people? What is their significance? In all the way he composed the work allows for a level of accessibility and intrigue within the viewer. For Johnson, Rogers's book was not only an important educational resource, but was extremely significant because this was, in a way, a pretty phenomenal communal project. The fact that these figures were specifically chosen by actual people to represent, the positive forces of change in the world was not lost on the artist. Again, it should be noted that all figures are from different fields or sectors of the culture. And, they showed that the fight for freedom and equality has to be like a multi-pronged approach. In other words, there's no field where people cannot make a positive and substantive difference. The phrase against the odds is extremely powerful in that these figures were able to not only become powerhouses in their own right, but all felt it was important to uplift their communities. That idea of reaching backwards and bringing your people to go forward. I also think of going against the odds in reference to William H. Johnson himself. Despite the very tragic later years, his life and his work still resonates with people, and I think has and will continue to prove to be important when talking about the influence the arts have on our culture, history, education, and society at large. And with that, I will hand it back over to Dalila.
Kenlontae, thank you for this close reading of these works and for this rich examination of the two loans from Hampton University to this exhibition. I'm going to just turn it over now to Phoebe, who will share more about the exhibition's interpretation.
Great, thanks so much, Dalila. I'm actually going to start with some close looking with a piece in SAAM's collection that I think you'll see is pretty visually linked to this one we just looked at, Against the Odds. Thank you. So this painting is titled Women Builders. And I'm gonna, again, give us a moment, about 15 seconds, just for close looking. And then I'm gonna ask my co-panelists, Dalila and Kenlontae, if they have any observations. So I'll give us about 15 seconds to just take a look closely. So I'm curious, Dalila, is there anything that stands out to you in particular looking at this?
Absolutely. I'm struck by sort of the recurring theme of the simplicity and the kind of lineup. There's a scholar and curator, Makita Best, who has written a really phenomenal article, and she describes what she calls William H. Johnson's scrapbook aesthetics. And so she's actually arguing that these are not necessarily just sort of diagrammatic pictures, but they actually represent the idea that he would have been going through the history books or going through primary sources and kind of creating a painterly version of a scrapbook. And that's like kind of a counter-hegemonic mode, because it's like, well, we have all these mainstream histories. Let's create an alternate history by cutting and pasting and bringing together all these reference images into one plane. And I can't help but see both the buildings and the faces as equally having equal standing as portraits of a type. And so, yeah, that's my initial thought.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thank you. And I definitely see that scrapbook aesthetic here with these sort of bust portraits of women interspersed with these buildings that we see, and some symbols as well in the background. So it's almost like, for me, this painting, the first time that I looked at it, raised so many questions about, you know, who these figures are and why they're included here together. So it's definitely sort of an invitation to curiosity in my mind. Kenlontae, is there anything that stands out to you, or things that you're wondering about the painting?
Well, yeah, just to continue what you said, like kind of like that level of intrigue, you know, if I hadn't known nothing about, you know, Johnson's work, and this was the first piece that I had seen of his, I would immediately be wondering, you know, again, obviously who these women are, but like clearly they have some connection to these buildings. And I think in a way, the buildings kind of have a personality themselves. And so like Dalila said, it's kind of like portraits of those as well. And so again, I think the level of intrigue is just very interesting to me. And going back to the against the odds piece, you know, I feel like Johnson himself was really adamant about like bringing people into the conversation, bringing people into this, you know, having them learn about the history. And so having him create these spaces where people can, you know, wonder about these people and the histories, I think is fascinating.
Absolutely, thank you. So this painting, we noticed some visual similarity to Against the Odds with the green background and sort of the rows of portraits. There's also a similarity in the way that it was put together, in that they're both based on books. So this painting actually takes its name from a 1931 book by Sadie Iola Daniel. And that book profiled 7 African-American women who really broke through racial and gender barriers from the late 19th to early 20th centuries by founding institutions that served their communities, from schools to businesses to social service organizations. So for me, you know, thinking about Johnson's inclusion of these women builders, as he called them, alongside abolitionists and civil rights activists in this Fighters for Freedom series, really shows that his understanding of freedom was really expansive, and that he understood that, you know, the right to a quality education, to safety, to economic opportunity, those are all essential parts of what it means to be free. So just to give you a little bit of context about who some of these figures are, I'll just do a quick overview. The top row from left to right, we have Lucy Craft Laney, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and Maggie Lena Walker. In the middle, wearing blue, is Jane Edna Hunter. And to her right is actually a woman who's not pictured in the book, but we think it's the author herself, Sadie Iola Daniel, who was actually an educator herself as an assistant professor of history at Minor Teachers College here in DC. And then in the bottom row, on the far left, we have Mary McLeod Bethune, who's perhaps the best known of these figures, Janie Porter Barrett, and Nannie Helen Burroughs. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So here you can see Johnson's source material, his reference image for one of these portraits. So the book contained these photographic portraits of each of these women. And this is a photo of Janie Porter Barrett, who I wanted to talk about because she actually has a really close connection to Hampton. She attended the Hampton Institute herself, graduating in 1885. And she taught night school classes there for a few years after graduating. And then she married her husband in 1889, and they established an informal daycare out of their home in Hampton, which kind of grew over the next year or two to really become a community hub that was focused on improving life and offering social services. So that was formally organized into what they called the Locust Street Social Settlement, which was the country's first settlement house for African Americans. And it offered clubs, classes, athletic programs to support the Black community in Hampton. And then later in 1915, she actually founded a school in Hanover County, Virginia, called the Virginia Industrial School for Colored Girls, which served Black girls who were considered, quote unquote, delinquent or dependent by the state. And the school was unique in that it really focused on rehabilitation over punishment, teaching its students vocational skills, life skills, and it became a model for other schools of its type. If you go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to mention that we have a digital resource available on the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And this is accessible via the exhibition webpage for Fighters for Freedom. But this is a resource called Decoding the Paintings that actually allows you to sort of explore some of the people, places, symbols in 8 of the Fighters for Freedom paintings, including women builders. And if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. You can see an example of how you can read more about figures like Janie Porter Barrett. And if you're in the platform, you can actually hover over some of the images in the painting to find out which specific buildings are depicted next to the women. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to briefly mention one other figure in this painting, a person who has a local connection for those of us based in DC. So this is Nannie Helen Burroughs. And Nannie Helen Burroughs founded her own school here in DC that was funded really by many small donations from community members. Religious leaders, business owners. Actually, Maggie Lena Walker, who I mentioned is in the upper right of this painting, she chartered a bank in Richmond, Virginia, and she was one of the donors to Nannie Helen Burroughs' school. So she was able to found the National Training School for Women and Girls in 1909 that was later renamed the Nannie Helen Burroughs School in her honor. And the school really emphasized professional training for working class Black women, preparing them for careers beyond domestic labor and sort of fostering independence through financial literacy. It also emphasized cultural pride and required a Black history course for graduation. And Burroughs was also a figure on the national stage, really becoming an advocate for African-American civil rights, as well as for women's suffrage. And I love her sort of skyward gaze in this photograph, and in the painting as well. So I want to move forward to the next slide, if we could, and just share some of the interpretive strategies that we implemented when bringing Johnson's work to the public here at SAAM. So as part of the larger Smithsonian institution, we had the unique opportunity to make connections to objects at other museums' collections, which allowed us to sort of bring more voices into the exhibition, and bring these figures to life in a unique way. So we created 5 videos featuring Smithsonian curators, each talking about an object in their collection and what it can tell us about the fighters for freedom. And I think the link to this video is going in the chat. Thank you. So what you're seeing here is a still from the video featuring Modupe Labodi, who's the curator of African-American social justice history at the National Museum of American History. And in the video, you'll hear her discuss the object that you see there, which is a cash register that belonged to Nannie Helen Burroughs, and was used at her school. And it's beautiful. It's ornately engraved, and it's a really interesting window into who she was. Next slide, please. So it was really important to us in planning the exhibition to offer visitors many different entry points for engaging with the artworks and the historical content. So you see here just a few images of additional interpretive elements in the galleries. So on the left, you see a visitor using one of our kiosks that sort of bring the Decoding the Paintings online resource that I mentioned into the gallery space and allow you to dig further into some of the imagery in Johnson's paintings. And in the center, you see there our media space where we're bringing to life some of the fighters for freedom through video, letting you hear their voices, see them perform. You see Marian Anderson there performing at the Lincoln Memorial. And then on the right is an example of one of the resources we brought into the show for accessibility. We have 4 3D replicas, tactile reproductions of paintings in the show that are designed for visitors who are blind or have low vision. And those were produced by the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, which was a previous venue for the traveling exhibition. There are additional parts of the show not pictured here, including a reading room featuring children's books about the fighters, as well as the visitor response wall. But I'd like to close, if you go to the next slide, by kind of returning to this prompt that we shared at the beginning of the program. And we're still accepting your responses in the Q&A if you'd like to share your thoughts about this question of who inspires you by fighting for freedom today. And it was really a goal of our teams to continue Johnson's work of connecting history to the present and grappling with this question of who he might include in his Fighters for Freedom series if he was still working on it today. So we decided to invite students from across the country to share with us who inspires them today by fighting for justice. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here this mural that you'll encounter in the last room of the gallery space if you're able to visit the exhibition at SAAM. It's one of my favorite parts of the exhibition. It's really special and moving to read these responses from students across the country, from about 3rd grade through high school seniors. And their responses are really wide-ranging, including people like environmental activists, to politicians, to athletes, entertainers, even family members and community members who inspire them. And there's some interesting connections to the figures that Johnson painted as well. So I thought I'd end by sharing some of their words with you. I'm just going to share a few examples. If you go to the next slide, please. So here we have a response from Anaya, who's a 9-year-old in Skokie, Illinois. And she's writing about Ala Morabit, who's a doctor and global leader in health advocacy and gender equality. So I'll just give you a moment to read that response for yourself. Next slide, please. So this is from Esther in Nashville, Tennessee. And she wrote about being inspired by the ballet dancer Misty Copeland. I'll give you a moment to read that one as well. All right. I love the ways that you can link some of the figures that students are writing about to Johnson's fighters. He painted dancers as well, like Josephine Baker and Catherine Dunham. So it's cool to see that trajectory. Next slide, please. So since we've been kind of focusing on the impact of educational spaces and leaders tonight, I thought I'd end with this response from Melanie in Newark, New Jersey, who's writing about a superintendent in her community. And I thought that was a fitting way to close. So I'll give you a moment to read her response. All right, and I'm seeing some responses from you all in the Q&A. So I see Stacey Abrams has come up. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, RBG. Excellent. And Dalila and Kenlontae, if there's anything else that you're seeing, feel free to jump in as well.
No, I mean, all of these responses are really wonderful. And what these young people have written is really great. Just in the fact that what's her name here? Melanie is so aware of the ways that local politics influence, her education and her future is outstanding. The kids are all right, as they say. I'm going to take this as an opportunity to pivot to our final section of today's program and invite our SAAM's community outreach consultant, Valerie Cooper, onto the screen. Valerie is who we have to thank for having this program today. It was really her idea to have this Juneteenth celebration, and this is the second annual of the ones that she has been guiding us through in the last 2 years. So over to you, Valerie.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Dalila. That was wonderful. And the entire presentation tonight has just been incredibly moving, starting with your introduction and the overview of Juneteenth, to the presentations, the interpretation of the artwork, and also the statements from the students. They just come with such wisdom. So taking a look at the Q&A from the audience, and it's not too late if you're listening and have a question to add to the list. I want to start with a question from Larry West. And I think, Phoebe, you might be able to help address this question. It has to do with the painting of Harriet standing with the rifle. And he wants to know whether a symbol for the railroad track was included by the house at the top on the left. I know that I've taken your course. It was incredibly informative, and lots of the paintings had railroad tracks. So can you talk a little bit about what that might symbolize?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you, Larry. So you're right. The Harriet Tubman painting in Sam's collection does include sort of this border going around the bottom. It's hard to see in the reproduction on the screen, but you might be able to see it's sort of the purple railroad track on the brown there. Yeah. And he included that railroad track motif in a couple of his other paintings as well. So, I think given that this is Harriet Tubman, there's an immediate connection to the Underground Railroad there. And just thinking about, what that means and symbolizes. But, his paintings are so narrative and there's so much symbolism happening. I love when he sort of repeats those symbols throughout multiple paintings.
Okay, thank you for that. Since you're focusing on that, are we looking at two suns rising in the background, or is that a sun rising and a sun setting? What exactly was Johnson trying to depict with those two, what appears to be, could be two suns, or could be the sun and the moon? What are we looking at there?
Happy to take that one, but Dalila or Kenlontae, feel free to jump in. I always like to read it as sort of a rising and setting sun, and looking at the two halves of the painting, it looks to me like maybe the right side is more nighttime. I also see what looks like the North Star in the sky, so it makes me think about sort of freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad and using the stars at night to guide them on their journey. But there's also sort of the symbolic aspect of rising and setting suns and sort of thinking about the passage of time and change. So I think there's, that's how I read it anyway, but there's a lot of different interpretations that you could bring to the work.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And we're going to move on to a few other questions. I want to thank, though, the audience for interpreting this painting, because there's several questions that have to do with the symbolism in this pic. But I want to give a few other persons from the audience a chance to talk a little bit about a different topic. And that is, there's a question out here that wants to know if we could talk a little bit more about how his work was almost destroyed and what was the motivation behind that and what actually saved the day. So who wants to?
I can take that one.
First. Okay.
So during the time where he was hospitalized, he actually initially went to Europe to stay with Holka's his wife's family, and while he was over there, his mental health deteriorated more and more, and so eventually he had to be sent to the hospital in New York. And when he came back over here, his work was housed in like a storage facility. And although they did use some of his funding to keep up with the expenses, most of the funding was being used by state funding. And so as the time went on, the funding was simply running out, and one could argue that there wasn't much appreciation for his work at that moment. And so they simply didn't think anything of it. And so when the word got out that his work was in danger of being disposed of, someone reached out to the Harmon Foundation, because they knew that the Harmon Foundation and William H. Johnson had a very long and complex history, and they knew that they would be able to take on the work, and they did. And of course, there was a lot of legal back and forth, but ultimately they became the legal stewards of the work.
Can I add just one other detail that I find really interesting? Palmer Hayden, another artist, who was employed by the Harmon Foundation. And it's in large part due to his eye and really helping the Harmon Foundation identify this as a collection that needed to be saved, that it became part of the Harmon Foundation. So I guess the reason why I'm saying that is it's not just that there was this sort of white philanthropic organization. There was Black artists who were deeply invested in preserving his legacy. Yeah.
Thank you so much for adding that additional perspective, and Kenlontae, for you kicking it off. I want to turn now to the panelists. This is Juneteenth. This is a Juneteenth celebration, and I think that the fighters for freedom that Johnson depicted would be so incredibly proud of us for continuing the legacy. The one thing that strikes me, though, is that of all the fighters for freedom that Johnson depicted, I don't recall seeing any artist. And I wonder if he himself thought of himself as a fighter for freedom. So given that the art world is our profession, and that I believe one day all of you are going to be viewed as fighters for freedom in our profession, 21st century African-American curators, Dalila, Kenlontae, Educator, Phoebe, I want to ask you all to share with me, if you can, what fighter for freedom in the art world would you think that Johnson would paint if we were painting today? Is there some artist that you'd like to share about, one? And two, what are you doing to preserve their legacy? And Kenlontae, you and I had a conversation not too long ago about the importance of sharing legacy about artists, educating our youth. So might you want to start?
Absolutely. First of all, great question. When I think of an artist who was really of service to the people and was striving to kind of, make this positive contribution to society, I immediately think of Dr. John T. Biggers. And if there are any Hampton alum on the call today, that's a name that definitely rings a bell. And ever since, so he was a student here at Hampton, and as a student, he was always taught to be of service to others, but also as an artist to really find your own voice. And that really resonated with him throughout his entire life, so much so that once he left Hampton, at the very young age of 25, he actually started his own art department at Texas Southern, which was a pretty phenomenal feat, just in general, but particularly at that time, Texas Southern was segregated. And so we see that being, aside from being like a tremendous support for his students in all of his the places he taught at, his aim was really to bridge the gap between the Black diaspora as well, which you'll see in his work. He did several travels throughout West Africa and would also note the similarities between West African culture and the Black South in the United States, which was not really spoken about at that time. And so John Biggers is one of my favorite artists, and I've definitely been all into his work as of recently, because I'm currently, to your point of what I'm doing currently to kind of help prolong his legacy. I'm curating a pretty large exhibition here for the Hampton University Museum, and a bulk of the work included will be drawings that he did as a student here at Hampton that have never been on display or shown in an exhibition at all. And so in all, it will be a retrospective of his work from student to teacher and mentor. And the exhibition, just a little nugget, is slated for mid-April 2025. And so if you're in the Hampton area, please check that out. And more information about that soon.
How incredibly exciting and honorable to preserve the legacy of Biggers, who is clearly a fighter for freedom. as an artist. Dalila, do you have someone you'd like to share about in that space?
I do, but I just wanted to back up to, because I've been dying to say this last little bit, in terms of, did Johnson see himself as a fighter for freedom? I think he was participating in like a real movement, an avant-garde to make Black history visible. When he was creating his work, Carter G. Woodson had just, founded Negro History Week, maybe a decade or so before, and Schomburg was donating his work or selling his work to the New York Public Library. So there are all these people invested in kind of creating the discipline of African-American history. And he is doing those same strategies in his work. And there's a scholar, Jarvis Gibbons, who talks about this as a fugitive pedagogy, as a real act of resistance and struggle to kind of speak and provide evidence of Black intellectual capacity and political agency. So I imagine that he saw himself as a part of that larger movement. In that sense, I do see him as a fighter for freedom. And I just briefly, yes, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to make a plug for the exhibition that I'm also working on. I'm working on an exhibition on Elizabeth Catlett. She was a phenomenal printmaker and sculptor who, from her earliest years at Howard University all the way to her death in 2012, almost 100 years of activism. She both portrayed and critiqued systems of oppression within her work, but she also really got out there and engaged in protest rallies, both in the United States and in Mexico, where she became a citizen. So that show you can look forward to in September 13th at the Brooklyn Museum, and then here at the National Gallery of Art in DC in 2025.
Oh my goodness. Our 21st century African-American curators are on the move. I think Johnson would be incredibly proud. In fact, our ancestors in general, about the difference that you both are making in the art space. And as we celebrate Juneteenth, it couldn't give me more pleasure than to say thank you all. Thank you to Phoebe, especially because she was my teacher and taught me a lot about William H. Johnson and his paintings. I actually passed the course, so I assume I learned a lot and contributed a lot. But I want to just thank the viewing audience too overall for coming in today. Tomorrow we have in-person tours. They're full, but the museum is open from 11:30 to 7 p.m. Feel free to stop by, see the Fridays for Freedom in person. You got to see it in person. And thank you all again for joining. Happy Juneteenth. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Valerie. I'll just ask everybody to stay on. If you want to give your feedback about the program, there should be a survey that pops up. So keep your browser open. Thank you. Thank you so much.